This is the second panel in the, on the topic of indigeneity and work in the ILERA conference. And this is a contribution from the International Labour Organization to this conference, with the idea to share very recent findings from ILO research undertaken on the situation of indigenous peoples on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of ILO Convention number 169 concerning indigenous and tribal peoples. This is a treaty that the organization has adopted in 1989 and has been ratified by a number of countries, but challenges remain in its implementation and also with regard to promoting its further ratification. And so the purpose of this panel is to share research finding, because one of the major issues that we are facing with regard to indigenous peoples is also the absence of data on which policymakers can rely and on which indigenous peoples themselves can rely in advocating improvements in laws, policies and regulations to improve their situation. Convention 169 addresses a variety of policy areas, from land to participation to consultation, etc. We are not going to go in all of it, but we wanted to give a very timely snapshot of the data that we have and address some of the underlying governance issues that policymakers are facing in promoting and protecting the rights of indigenous peoples. And we will have a we will have the discussion sort of getting into the COVID crisis also, because we see a lot of issues that have existed before being exacerbated by the COVID crisis, but we will also want to look into the broader issue of development in the SDG framework and also climate change, because we see a lot of linkages to promote policy coherence in these discussions. The different colleagues will address also these issues. I would like to mention that we have a number of speakers from the ILO who were directly involved in the drafting of the report. They are co-authors of the report. And we also joined by Sandra del Pino, diversity advisor in the Pan American Health Organization. And we work very closely in the UN system across agencies. So it's a pleasure to have a colleague from a sister agency on board also to address these issues in relation to COVID, where we see a rapidly evolving situation in Latin America with particular impact also on indigenous people. So this is a bit the scenario that we're having. This is a practitioners panel. So we are most of us, actually all the panelists, we are international civil servants. So we are not academics, but we have all an interest in academic writing as well and research, and this is also part of our work. So we are happy to contribute to ILERA's conference for the Americas in 2020. So the first speaker will be Umberto Cattaneo, who is an economist at the International Labour Office, and he was the mastermind when it comes to data for this report. It's an interdisciplinary report, so we have lawyers, economists working on this. This report is also available at www.ilo.org/indigenous, and we will paste the link directly also in the chat in a little while for those who want to look at the full report. And Umberto will be followed by Maria Victoria Cabrera. She is a lawyer in the International Labour Office, specializing in international labor standards and in particular ILO Convention 169. So she will address a little bit the issue of application and gaps in application of 169 and how these issues link together with also the gaps that we're seeing in the data. We will then have a short round of questions and interactions, and we'll have then the two following speakers will be Rishabh Dhir. He is a research officer in the research department of the ILO. He's been also a lead author of this report, and he will try to make the linkages between findings of this report and climate change and the broader development agenda. And we conclude with Sandra del Pino, then also basically with the latest developments that we're seeing from the COVID crisis and its impact on indigenous peoples, and challenging at also addressing this situation as far as it concerns indigenous peoples. So this is all for my introduction. Thank you to all of you for connecting. We have reached a critical mass of participants, so we are more participants than panelists. That's already a very first important step, and maybe some more people will join us as we go along. But for now, Umberto, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'm gonna start my presentation. So thank you very much. Thanks so much for giving me the floor. I would like to start with the identification of indigenous people. Indigenous and tribal people across the world. There are more than 5,000 different indigenous people groups that live in more than 90 countries. One of the criteria that there are several criteria that has been used to identify indigenous people, and Convention 169 actually identifies as self-identification the primary criteria for identifying indigenous people, and the convention mentions also that this criteria can be complemented with the objective identifications. Objective criteria for identifying indigenous people has been relevant in certain countries, like in Peru or in Costa Rica, where there are databases of indigenous community to facilitate access to rights for indigenous people. But the biggest challenge to identify indigenous and tribal people came when we started to gather data for indigenous people, because in most of the surveys that we used, there is self-identification question, but in others actually we identified indigenous people based on their primary language spoken. Across the world, we estimated that there are 476.6 million indigenous people, or this represents 6.2% of the global population. Another important number that we have to mention is the share of indigenous people that lives in countries that have ratified the Convention 169. Across the world, only 15.7% of the 476 million indigenous people live in the 23 countries that have ratified the convention. And this is a challenge, because this report and this data analysis was actually carried out for the 30th anniversary of adoption of Convention 169. And still, after 30 years, only 23 countries, unfortunately, have ratified the convention. And we really hope that this report will lead to more ratification. Then, in which regions and across which income groups indigenous people live? We can see from these two pie charts that indigenous people live in Asia and the Pacific, 70.5% of them, and mainly in middle-income countries, as we can see from the right-hand pie chart. Then we have also 16.3% of indigenous people living in Africa, 11.5% of indigenous people living in Latin America and the Caribbean, which corresponds to around 53 million indigenous people, and only 1.6% of indigenous people in North America, and 0.1% in Europe and Central Asia. We were also able to identify the type of place of residence of indigenous people. We know that around 380 million indigenous people live in rural areas. This is not surprising, because very often indigenous people are attached to traditional territories cities, and they find employment related to the land that they cultivate. So this is actually not surprising, but we have a variation across regions. For instance, in Northern America, we have only 31% of indigenous people in rural areas, and while in Africa we have 82% of indigenous people in rural areas. Our report I also explored the labor market situation of indigenous people, and the first statistics that we looked at when analyzing the labor market situation of indigenous people is the employment to population ratio, so the participation of indigenous people in employment. We found that indigenous people are more likely to be employed than their non-indigenous counterparts, and that across the world, 63% of indigenous people are employed compared to 59% of non-indigenous people. Just a quick remark, when we compare data for indigenous and non-indigenous people, we are talking about the same countries. So the two statistics were calculated using the same number of countries. Despite the very high participation in employment of indigenous people, we see a difference when we look at women and men, because indigenous women have 49% chances of being in employment, while indigenous men 77%, despite these numbers are higher than the respective non-indigenous counterparts. So one, I think, of the main finding of the report on the part on the labor market is that despite higher participation of indigenous people in employment, the working conditions that they often face are poorer when compared to their non-indigenous counterpart. Starting from informality rates, indigenous people depend a lot for their livelihoods on informal economy work. We have 86% of indigenous people who have an informal job compared to 66% of their non-indigenous counterpart. This is a gap of 20 percentage points. Across region, we found that this gap is highest in Latin America, where indigenous people have an informality rate of 83%, while non-indigenous people only of 51%. One of the potential reasons for this poor working conditions for indigenous people might be the educational attainment of indigenous people in employment. Over the past 40 years, we have seen an improvement in education and the closure of the gaps in educational achievement across the world, but it seems that this didn't occur for the majority of indigenous people, which tends to be left a bit behind, because we have 47% of indigenous people in employment without any kind of education, compared to 17% of non-indigenous people. This is a huge difference, because it's more, indigenous people are more than twice as likely to have no education than non-indigenous people when in employment, which is huge. And this difference is actually bigger for when we compare indigenous women with their non-indigenous counterpart, and also with indigenous men. So basically, indigenous women have the highest chances of having no education when compared to their non-indigenous counterpart, but also when compared to indigenous and non-indigenous men. Usually the lower educational achievement might explain why indigenous people are less likely to be found in wage and salaried work. Across the world, only 28% of indigenous people is in wage and salaried work, compared to 50% of their non-indigenous counterparts. Education might be one of the reasons. The other reasons might be that the work of indigenous people is more attached to their land, and therefore they prefer to be in on-account work. As we can see here, we have 50% of indigenous people in on-account work compared to 38% of their non-indigenous counterparts. We went one step further and we looked only at wage and salaried work and at the pay, at the salary that indigenous people, when in wage and salaried work, they are able to earn. And the finding were dramatic, because we found that when indigenous people are in wage and salaried work, they face a pay penalty, and on average they earn 18.5% less than their non-indigenous counterparts. This is what we named the indigenous pay gap, and across region is highest in Latin America and Caribbean, where indigenous people earn around 30% less than their non-indigenous counterparts. One of the potential explanation for these pay gaps is the sectorial distribution of indigenous employment. We found that indigenous people are employed mainly in agriculture, 55% of them, but actually the finding here is that 45% of indigenous people are outside the agricultural sector, because one of the commonly held beliefs is that indigenous people were mainly in agriculture, but we found that 45% of them are actually in sectors that are not related to agriculture. But despite this, the pay gaps persist. Another area that we explored as part of this report was the poverty situation of indigenous people. Poverty and labor market situation are closely intertwined, and actually what we inferred is that the poorer working condition of indigenous people translated then in a poverty situation that is more marked for indigenous people. We were able to gather data for 23 countries that represents around 83% of the 476 million indigenous people in the world. And we found that in these 23 countries, indigenous people represent 9.3% of the population, but 18.7% of the extreme poor, which is actually a very big share. We also calculated the standard poverty accounts using the three World Bank poverty lines, the $90, $320, and $550. And when we look at the extreme poverty line, so the $90 a day poverty line, we found that 18.2% of indigenous people are living below $90 a day, compared to just 6.8% of their non-indigenous counterpart. This is a huge gap, and the higher likelihood of indigenous people to be in poverty is confirmed not only across different levels of income, so across the income distribution, but also in rural and urban settings. In rural settings, as you can see in the graph on the right-hand side, the poverty accounts are lower than in rural areas, but indigenous people are still more likely to be poor. Thank you very much. My presentation is over, and I would like to hand the floor to Maria Victoria Cabrera for an explanation of Convention 169. Thanks.
Maria Victoria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Umberto and Martin, and thank you for the organizers. Thank you to the organizers of this conference for including this session into the conference program. I will also share my screen with you. Can you see the slides?
Yes, Maria Victoria, we can see it.
Thank you. So I will complement Umberto's presentation addressing legal and institutional aspects that are relevant in the context of the ILO Convention on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, number 169. As Martin has already mentioned in the introduction, this is a quite unique convention. Some of you may ask yourself why the ILO comes with such a comprehensive convention, but actually the answer is that the ILO has been, since its creation, has been committed to the situation of indigenous peoples. At the beginning, focusing on the situation of indigenous workers, but later on, focusing on other aspects, social, legal, and economic aspects that affect indigenous peoples. And the ILO is actually the revision of a previous convention, Convention 107, that had a rather focus on integration, whereas Convention 169 has a strong focus on institutions, participations, and the right of indigenous peoples to decide their own terms of development. So it's a treaty, legally speaking, it's binding for the countries that have ratified. It has been mostly ratified in Latin America. 14 countries, Latin American countries, are parties to the convention, and in some of them, the convention has been recognized as being part of the so-called constitutional bloc. It means that the convention's provision has constitutional ranks, and it has been indeed, in fact, the convention has been several times invoked before national courts by indigenous persons. It covers a wide range of issues, from identification. The criteria that Umberto mentioned are spelled out in the convention, state institutions, participation, consultation. It of course has a focus on labor conditions, social security, health, education, among other aspects. And one important element of Convention 169 is that besides recognizing specific rights for indigenous peoples, it's an instrument of governance, actually. It's an instrument that contains guidelines for governments on how to design their institutions, how to establish mechanisms for participation of indigenous peoples in issues affecting them. So I will focus on key areas of the convention that I think are relevant in general, from a governance perspective, but also relevant in terms of the COVID pandemic. So one important aspect of the convention is that it provides for a coordinated and systematic action for the realization of the rights contained in the convention. So the governments are required to undertake or develop a coordinated and systematic action to protect the rights of indigenous peoples. This means in practice that even though there might be some institutions dealing with indigenous peoples issues, depending on the field of action, education or health, labor, there should be a coordination among these bodies, a mechanism of communication and consistency, so that the convention can be effectively put in place. Within this context, indigenous peoples should be included and should participate in administering programs that affect their rights undertaken by these institutions. And this obligation to undertake coordinated and systematic action should be also read together with the obligation that governments have to ensure that institutions or agencies exist to administer programs on indigenous peoples. I will later on mention some examples of countries that have already established specific bodies to deal with indigenous issues. And that can be also looked at when developing COVID responses. A key provision, perhaps the most important provision of the convention, is Article 6. Article 6 provides for the obligation of the states to consult indigenous peoples whenever consideration is being given to legislative or administrative measures that might affect indigenous peoples directly. It's a participatory provision. It's an obligation to enable participation, but it is subject to certain requirements that are spelled out by the article itself. It should be on this participatory process should be undertaken through the representative institutions of indigenous peoples. It should be appropriate to the circumstances as established in the second paragraph of Article 6, and it should have the aim of achieving agreement or consent to the proposed measures. This actually has been an element on which countries have been working hard in developing a legislation or regulation on consultation. in several, the issue of consultation has been also the key issue before national courts when dealing with the Convention 169. But apart from consultation that relates to this specific legislative or administrative measure that might affect indigenous peoples directly, indigenous peoples have in general a right to participate at all levels of decision making in the bodies that are responsible for programs affecting them. If it is, I mean, besides having specific consultation mechanisms that might address specific measures, for example, the adoption of a mining law that might affect indigenous peoples, or an education on a law on education, participation means that they should be in continuous dialogue with the government in the creation of policies and in the supervision of policies and the design of policies that might affect them. Another important provision, especially in terms of COVID, and Sandra will elaborate more on that from the point of view of PAHO, it's a health provision. So the convention requires governments to ensure adequate health services for indigenous peoples. In doing so, governments are required by the convention that to establish health services that are community-based. This means that indigenous peoples take part in the administration, in the organization of these services, giving due consideration and respect to traditional practices and medicines. This is also a source of employment for indigenous peoples because the convention provides that the health workers should be to the extent possible, I mean, indigenous persons, and as established in the fourth paragraph of Article 25, there should be coordination. So we have seen that in the COVID crisis, there are some communities undertaking by themselves some preventive measures, but I think one of the important aspects to highlight is this coordination element, that besides recognizing them the right to develop their traditional medicines, this should be in communication with more general measures adopted by the Ministries of Health. And what are the progress and challenges that we have seen and highlighted in the report that we launched? And I will focus on the Latin American region, where we find most certifications. There is a huge progress in terms of legal recognition. Many constitutions, many countries have recognized, constitutionally recognized the existence of indigenous peoples, and I would say all 14 countries in Latin America have already included the element of self-identification of indigenous peoples in national censuses. So now we have data on the existence of indigenous peoples among Latin American countries. Some countries, a number of them have established elite institutions in charge of indigenous issues. The convention doesn't provide a unique formula on how the institution should be, whether it should be a ministry or it should be an institute. In fact, for example, in Mexico, we have an institute on indigenous peoples. The same is in Paraguay, but in other cases, there are vice ministries that are in charge of implementing the convention. What is true is that in countries that have these elite institutions on indigenous peoples, we also see more progress made in terms of institutions that are in charge of supervising procedures of consultation for indigenous peoples. Talking about consultation, well, some countries like Peru, Chile, Costa Rica have already adopted some legal frameworks on consultation. In the case of Peru, it's a law adopted by the parliament. In the case of Costa Rica, Chile, this regulation has the form of a decree, executive decree. And this, we see in practice that these frameworks are put into place, and there are some consultations already reported. In countries where there is no law consultation, no legal framework, courts have taken the lead in providing guidance In many countries, we have seen problems of consistency between the jurisprudence, and this, of course, create concern in some actors about legal certainty. A big number of countries have already recognized the importance of traditional medicine, or, for example, in the case of Brazil and Argentina, they have developed specific health policies and programs concerning indigenous peoples. In the case, for example, of Nicaragua, there is a specific law on traditional medicine. So there is an area that in which we see also a lot of development. Where we still think that, and we have from our research on laws and policies, what we see there is still much to be done. It's in terms of integrating the indigenous peoples dimension in employment policies, and I think this is one of the causes, the reasons that are behind the number shown by Umberto. National employment policies are designed in many cases without addressing the specific circumstances of indigenous peoples, the specific concerns. The programs on vocational training are not always culturally adequate for indigenous peoples. So these are for sure one of the areas that has to be explored when deciding labor measures in the post-COVID situation. And I stop here and I give the floor to Martin again. I will stop the share.
Muted. Okay. Thank you so much, Maria Victoria, and also thank you, Umberto, for these initial presentations. So as we have indicated at the beginning, we would open it up for reactions and for comments and questions to these presentations, which are giving a rough overview of research findings based on official statistics, which are obviously often inadequate, or sometimes not fully capturing or not fully reflecting the realities of indigenous peoples, but in some countries they exist, and from that it is possible to make some findings. On the other hand, we have a panorama where laws and policies are existing to apply this convention, but in many cases they are not yet strong enough, so the issue of participation is really crucial. So now, let me see, we haven't seen any comments on the chat, so I will just ask now people who want to speak or to comment to raise their hand, either electronically or switch on their camera and wave their physical hand to all of us, and we will be glad to accommodate and to listen. Jessica is on. Do you see on your side anybody wanting to take the floor?
No, I don't see any hands.
Excellent.
On my end.
So what I then, we have a question from Farid Asi from the University of Toronto, I believe. And the question is, could data sets of your report become available to researchers? So that's a very interesting question. Which speaks to methodology also, and maybe I would pass the floor to Umberto to speak about that question.
Yes, thank you very much, Martin. So the data sets that have been used in the report are, some of them, I would say most of them, are available online. So they are on National Statistics Office, not all of them. For some, we had to request access because they are linked to a specific research proposal. So you need to explain what you want to do with the dataset, and this is actually what we did to obtain them. In the annex of the report, there is a list with all the datasets we used, and the list of also of the institution that we contacted or where we downloaded the data. So I think this answers your question, and if you have any follow-up question or any additional detailed question, you can always send me an email, and I would be very happy to assist.
Thank you, Umberto. We will disclose your email address.
Yes.
Excellent. Just to maybe to add that we have used different data sets, no labor force surveys, census data, household surveys, and most of that is publicly available, which was quite amazing. And we depend, so, but for different figures, there's a different number of countries used. So the highest availability was for population numbers, where we were able to find data from 58 countries. Now it's fewer countries for other indicators, including in the area of poverty and employment. Great, Umberto's address is online. So with no further questions, we
sorry, there's actually 2 more questions that I got.
Yes, why don't you support people since you see them?
Yeah, so okay, so first question is, what type of work is mainly done by the indigenous people in corporate companies?
Excellent. So who will speak to this question? Maybe Umberto, you can start saying about what type. You maybe explain what we have in the report, what we have looked at, and then I can maybe add on from my end.
Yeah, can you repeat the question, because I didn't
Yes.
understand.
What type of work is mainly done by the indigenous people in corporate companies?
In corporate companies, yes. So we didn't look at the status in employment, but we looked at the sectoral aggregation of the sectoral distribution of indigenous people employment, and we have seen that when indigenous people, for the majority, are in agriculture, and we imagine that this agricultural employment is a small holding farmer work, but sometimes can also be through employment in corporations that are actually working in agriculture. Then the second largest share of employment where we find indigenous people is in market services. So market services basically are retail and wholesale trade, but they also include accommodation and food, because we also know that, I mean, Martin, I think, can say more about that afterwards, that some indigenous people work also in tourism sector and sustainable tourism. Then we have a certain amount of indigenous people, which is represented by 9% of their employment in construction, which is actually higher than the share of non-indigenous people in this sector. And maybe we can say that the last area where indigenous people are employed is a manufacturing sector, with 7.9% of indigenous people employed in the manufacturing sector, which for sure are mainly corporations that are actually in these sectors. And mining and quarrying, and which also include electricity, gas, and water supply, is just 1.1% of indigenous people employment. There are some differences when we look at men and women employment. For instance, women have double chances of being in construction compared to indigenous women, compared to non-indigenous women. So we have 3.6% of indigenous women in construction and just 1.5% of non-indigenous women in the same sector, which is kind of interesting because it's more than double share for indigenous women.
Thank you, Umberto. Just to add on, so we had mainly, as Umberto said, we looked at different sectors of the economy, and we looked at employment status. So salaried workers are maybe the workers that this question wanted to find out more. Unfortunately, we didn't look at within these categories, we didn't look at specific occupations within a sector from which one would conclude also where in the hierarchy of a company, for instance, people work, what type of work in the company they do, which could be interesting. We have other indicators that rather tend to indicate that, that indigenous workers, men and women in leadership positions, are would be an exception. So we don't have the specific data there, because we have a high level of informality. So these are sometimes enterprises that are not formalized, but still the private sector, if you want. At the other side, on the other hand, we see also that there is a lot of wage gap between indigenous and non-indigenous persons, which also sort of hints at positions that are at a lower level from a hierarchical point of view in companies. So of course there is, it would be very interesting to do more work on this. In the previous panel that we had today in the conference, which looked at indigeneity and work, we were also having this perspective of drilling down more into explaining some of this. No? So in our report, we are trying to analyze and understand this data based on the raw data and also some literature, but I think much more research needs to be done also to understand where indigenous peoples work, what they do, what are the challenges are, and even what was mentioned in the previous panel, this issue of changing the path of things will require indigenous peoples actually themselves being part of that solution in putting in place policies, including in an enterprise, in a company. You know? This issue of voice, of participation, of representation. And so this is a whole level of work that we are also doing in the ILO. We haven't covered in this report, but the idea of looking more into how schemes for affirmative action actually work, you know, like learning from maybe public sector experience in Canada, where we have actually administrative data on indigenous peoples in the civil service, for instance. No? So I'm not sure whether that applies also to the private sector in Canada, but I see people from Canada also connected. Maybe that's something you can also raise. So I think this is an initial, the data gap that we try to really address here is also to break with the myth that there is no statistical data on indigenous peoples in employment and in poverty, but there is, you know, it's not often used, it's not often found, it's maybe not often in the first page of the statistical office, but there is, because of course the data is also very, in many ways it's also very scandalous, because if you look at the certain gaps that you see, you ask yourself, why is this still the case? Why is it like that? So anyway, so this is remarks from a chair that is talking too much. No? We have another question in the pipeline, and maybe Jessica can go for it.
Yeah, so the second question is, what kind of education do indigenous people receive? So are they heavily represented in the arts field compared to the STEM field?
Yeah, Martin, can I take this?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, so this is actually not an easy, I mean, I would love to know, but this is not an easy question. So in the data that we use to show the educational achievement are from censuses, as Martin was saying, labor force and household surveys. And unfortunately, one of the limitations of this data set is that basically we don't have the field of education. And this is one of the challenges that is in labor statistics, since I think labor statistics started to exist, because it's how we measure this. If we know this, we would be able to measure skill mismatch, and it would be very interesting to know about skill mismatch for indigenous people. But unfortunately, this is not available. So there might be some small scale surveys or some qualitative interviews where this question about the field of education of indigenous people is explored. But at the time we compiled the report, we were not able to find nationally representative statistics on the topic, unfortunately. Even if it would be super interesting, because if available, would allow us to analyze the skill mismatch, because we could see in a labor force survey, we have the occupation of an indigenous person, we have the sector where it is employed, we might have, coming back to the question before, the sites of the enterprise where this person is working, so how many employees, but really the field of education is something that is missing from labor force surveys or censuses or outdoor surveys.
And I'm sorry, I have to add again something. In addition, we also have very little information about traditional skills and competencies which are sort of inherent assets of indigenous peoples, traditional knowledge, that becomes more important also for not only to maintain indigenous peoples' cultures and livelihoods, and for their development as distinct peoples, but also becomes more and more relevant in terms of climate change. And we will have listened to that in the second round of comments. So what we have in the report is really like information about data that are in employment, whatever status of employment, self-employed, employed, family workers, helping parents, and so on. But the level is the level of education. And there we see that there's a huge number, and for indigenous women, even a huge more share of people that are in employment, but they have no education. And that shows also the disadvantaged level in which indigenous peoples, then participate. You know, it's not that they are not participating in the labor market, they're actually having higher shares of employment than other people, which is due to poverty, because they cannot afford to sit idle, but they are extremely in a vulnerable position, in informality, lack of social protection, and so on. So, and I think this is also what we try to do, to go in between, taking like a entirely traditional economic approach to see labor and work, and on the other side also avoiding an approach that is essentializing indigenous peoples as people that are involved essentially in traditional occupations in their natural environment, which is in many cases true, but for the large majority of people, indigenous peoples, they are laboring in the informal economy under conditions of inequality and vulnerable to forced labor in many cases. So this is a bit the fine line to walk, really. Anyway, we have to move on, I think.
Sorry, there's one last question, if that's okay.
Yes.
It's from Joanna.
Yes.
Hi, thank you very
there.
much. It was very interesting, and I totally take your point and agree that, you know, having the data is really important and a very first start to really understanding. I was surprised actually that the North American percentage was so much smaller when you look at it on the global scale. You know, you kind of only pay attention to your own backyard sometimes, I guess. So lots of that was really interesting. My question is around, and I think it builds on what you were just saying, Martin, you know, that it is surprising maybe to many that the employment numbers proper are so high, but because the employment is in maybe what we would consider less good work, then the outcomes are still sort of worse for Indigenous people because of the low-skilled labor or the informal labor markets. And I was also curious in the North American data that it looks like actually for here, the employment actually may be less for Indigenous people than non-Indigenous. And I'm curious about whether that's because maybe we have less of an informal labor market in general, say compared to Latin America. But I'm also curious about what this data kind of suggests to the ILO in terms of intervention. Is it more that the direction might be to try to increase education levels and engage in more Indigenous participation in sort of the formal labor market, or is it a need or an indication to strengthen and better support the informal labor market, because perhaps that is more conducive to where some are living, or in terms of a sort of a traditional experience with work? Or is it a little bit of both? What's your sense kind of from this data?
Excellent, thank you so much. I'll just say one thing and then ask Umberto, because he's the economist, I'm the lawyer. So when we presented this report, we had a lot of feedback from Indigenous people represented also that basically they get the impression that we're presenting the informal economy as something bad, while they themselves see themselves as part of the informal economy. And that's something I think where in the discourse we have to become much better, because we are applying basically the standard definition of informal economy that the ILO has, but actually much of the things as Indigenous people do, and they consider themselves being in the informal sector because they they don't consider them as like part of the corporate sector or something like that, but it's still a formal, it's not informal economy according to ILO, no? So it's like, you know, so I think there is a little bit more sort of the languages and the discourse that needs to be more understanding of what is it there. Obviously, ILO is promoting formalization, but that doesn't mean that we want to go everybody to a factory and to give up the more resource-based, land-based, and the work that is important to maintain the culture and to use and their own culture as an asset, and also the property and the financial, you know, indigenous peoples are also landowners and run businesses and so on. So I think this is a little bit for that part of it, but more on the economist side, I think I'll give it over to you, Umberto, also for the North American.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much, Joanna, for your question. Yes, it's true. In Northern America, is an ILO region that includes United States and Canada, and the employment rates for indigenous people are actually slightly lower than that of their non-indigenous counterparts. I think that the factors might be several. We were not able, unfortunately, to calculate the poverty head count for North America. So this is something that might have explained, might have provided an explanation to your question. But my sense, I mean, this is just a sensation, it's not based on any statistical analysis, but is that in Northern America, indigenous people are less likely to be poor compared to the other regions, where maybe they live in situation where poverty is more prevalent, and therefore they face a need, as what Martin was saying, a need to work and not to stay idle to be out of poverty. So this is, I think, this is my sensation. But unfortunately, the data was not clear in the data, and we couldn't do that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I think with this, we move to the second round of speakers. And we will start with Rishabh Dhir from the research department. And we look forward to your presentation. Rishabh, you have the floor.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you to the organizers as well as to Jessica for organizing this session. I'll just try and share my screen. Is it visible, the presentation?
Yes, perfect. Perfect.
Right. So before joining the research department, I have been working with Martin on indigenous and tribal peoples issues for several years. And over the past few years, since specifically 2015, we have been enhancing our research on climate change, on sustainable development more broadly, to also look at the interlinkages between the kind of vulnerabilities that indigenous peoples face. And now most recently, you have COVID-19, which is adding to this list of vulnerabilities. Now, from 2015 onward, we see that there is a growing importance in international frameworks regarding indigenous peoples issues. So you have the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development with the aspiration, with the aim to leave no one behind. Then there is the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which explicitly identifies traditional knowledge to be crucial for climate action. Most recently, there has been the development of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform under the UNFCCC framework, which for the first time under the climate negotiations, you see a situation where indigenous peoples and member states sit at the same table to discuss climate action and the role of traditional knowledge. And then thirdly, there is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which also came about in 2015, which specifically too identified indigenous knowledge as a source which needs to complement scientific knowledge to mitigate and adapt to potential natural disasters. While these developments have been interesting and important, this does not necessarily mean they have been translating into concrete action on the ground. There have been some movement, but these have been largely global successes. And in that sense, the threats and challenges that indigenous peoples face continue, and to a large extent, they have been exacerbating. And these threats lie at the intersections between development, climate, and rights. We noticed in our research over the past few years that indigenous peoples are in a rather distinctive position. They face this distinct combination of issues that no other group faces. So one is poverty and inequality, which Umberto has already talked about, and our data makes it clear that indigenous people are the poorest of the poor. And several scientific research studies have been showing that the poorest are the most vulnerable to climate change. In Asia, for instance, World Bank estimates that about 100 million people will be pushed back into poverty because of climate impacts. And indigenous peoples, those who have come out of extreme poverty, are already on the edge of it. Hence, we also see the outside of the extreme poverty, the other dollar poverty lines, indigenous peoples are quite overrepresented there as well. Now, with the world of work specifically, indigenous peoples' livelihoods are interlinked with land and natural resources, specifically those that are residing in rural areas. About 70 million depend on forests. Yet at the same time, already they are facing land alienation, poor incomes, poor market linkages, skills and productivity issues, as well as lack of market access. And in this sense, with already the limitations that they already face, we have the situation wherein climate change degrades the natural resource base, livelihoods suffer. So the world of work suffers tremendously. And which adds to another vulnerability that indigenous peoples face through climate impacts. Then there is also the issue of geographic remoteness and vulnerability, in the sense that on the one hand, you have a scenario where indigenous peoples do not have adequate access to sustainable energy or infrastructure. So they are not able to make adequate incomes or reach out to areas through which they can sell their produce or products. On the other hand, a lot of the areas where indigenous peoples live are more vulnerable to climate impacts, coastal areas, for instance. So when the infrastructure is weak, adaptation capacities are weak. And then when the natural resource base is confronted with a changing climate, indigenous people struggle to cope. Then there is the issue of migration and the dependence on the informal economy. So on the one hand, we see that already climate impacts are pushing indigenous peoples into certain urban areas where they are more dependent on the informal economy. On the other hand, we see that in urban areas, indigenous peoples tend to be largely restricted to informal economy and often lead lives in informal settlements like slums in urban areas. And when disasters hit, when natural disasters specifically hit, and even with COVID-19 right now, we see that those people living in such circumstances or those people involved in the informal economy are disproportionately affected. With COVID-19 already, we are seeing in some countries that people are migrating back to rural areas. And with climate change too, this may be a trend at a later stage. Then there is the issue of gender inequality, where indigenous women in particular face discrimination from both within and outside of their communities. On the one hand, they are involved both in urban informal economy as well as in rural livelihoods. But on the other hand, they tend to face specific forms of discrimination, whether it is within their own communities, whether it is those communities that are not indigenous but living outside, which places them in a situation of precariousness with work. And when climate impacts hit, they are disproportionately impacted given the loss of income as well as the disproportionate amount of care work that they undertake. A classic example for this is that a lot of indigenous women have to travel long distances in rural areas to access water. However, with increasing instances of drought, indigenous women are having to walk longer distances, work more in more hazardous circumstances in the heat, and they may be vulnerable to violence and harassment in neighboring villages or areas which are not necessarily from their communities. And finally, indigenous peoples in several countries continue to be not recognized as indigenous peoples. And that limits the kind of rights that they are able to access and the institutional support they are able to access. Throughout the climate discussion, consultation participation, not just of indigenous peoples, but broadly, has been of great relevance to adequately address the threats of climate impacts. However, when indigenous peoples are not included in public policy, especially in climate policies, their specific needs and their specific vulnerabilities from climate impacts are not adequately addressed as well. There is also the issue of access to remedy in this entire scenario where climate impacts are affecting indigenous areas more, yet they have caused the least amount of climate change because their historic emissions have been quite low. While these threats and challenges have been continuing, as has been seen through the global developments, that indigenous peoples are also being recognized more and more as agents of change. And what does this mean? This means that indigenous people are not just victims in this story and not just subjects of development, but rather they are fundamental partners and crucial agents of change, whether it is to achieve the SDG, whether it is for effective climate action, or to spur green growth based on traditional knowledge. And our research has shown that indigenous peoples globally, over 470 million, which is, to put it in perspective, is more than the population of United States and Canada combined, are at the vanguard of an economic model which is grounded in the principles of a green economy, at the core of which are the unique traditional knowledge and knowledge systems, as well as the skills that system generates for mitigation and adaptation opportunities. And here we see that these skills and occupations can play a vital role for innovation, for green jobs, as well as for sustainable enterprise creation by indigenous peoples, and there are examples of cooperatives in this case. Now, the World Bank has estimated that indigenous peoples care for about 22% of the Earth's surface and protect about 80% of the remaining biodiversity on the planet. Without their active participation, adequately addressing climate change will not be possible, especially given these details. And we see that historically, traditional knowledge and occupations have been able to live sustainably with the environment, with the natural resources that indigenous peoples use. And hence, their traditional knowledge and occupation have been cutting across multiple sectors, which are blending both culture and economic and environmental sustainability. At the same time, more recently, knowledge systems and customary institutions are shaping new forms of the management of economic activity, which means that a cooperative may be managed not in a traditional business model sense, but through the melange of indigenous people's customary institutions as well as modern business techniques. A similar trend is also emerging with traditional knowledge systems that are adapting modern technology and as well as engaging with transformations in economies, societies, and institutions. What we then see is that indigenous peoples are a source of knowledge which enables them to have unique skill sets, unique skill sets which more and more modern day labor markets need if they are to adequately address the impacts of climate change, as well as innovate and develop an economy which is more sustainable with natural resources. To give some examples of co-benefits and synergies emerging from such an approach where indigenous knowledge and indigenous people's rights have gone hand in hand with poverty eradication as well as development is the case, for example, of Brazil, where deforestation rates during 2000 and 2012 were less than 1% in indigenous managed territories. And the CO2 emissions outside of these territories were 27 times more, which is a humongous difference from a climate lens. Similarly, there was a case in Indonesia where indigenous traditional knowledge saved the lives of over 80,000 people because they were able to predict that a tsunami was approaching to the shore and community members were able to move uphill. And these are just two very brief examples, but ILO has collaborated with the University of Oxford to capture stories from the field, from the ground, where indigenous peoples are on a daily basis operationalizing their traditional knowledge, not only to create jobs, but also to bring broader sustainability in the areas where they live, where there are non-indigenous peoples also living, whether it is predicting weather patterns, whether it is using techniques to improve agricultural productivity, so on and so forth. What this transition towards a more green economy also enables is that in leveraging traditional knowledge, there is also a route to addressing gender inequalities, given that indigenous women and girls play a vital role in traditional and non-traditional livelihoods, as well as unpaid care work. Indigenous women tend to be the custodians of traditional knowledge, and often this knowledge is passed on from one generation to the other by indigenous women. And this is a point where the skill sets and the knowledge associated with traditional activities can be built upon, where indigenous women can contribute specifically to natural resource management as well as agriculture and forestry, areas which are increasingly recognized as critical for both mitigation and adaptation. However, while this is what could be, the challenges, as have been highlighted earlier, and the threats that indigenous peoples are already facing, which are now being also magnified with the COVID situation, are there. And what is now more and more needed is an integrated approach to look at the kind of challenges indigenous peoples face. So, and hence ILO has the Decent Work Agenda, which is a driver for sustainable development and underpinned by the ILO Convention's recommendations, Convention number 169, specifically on indigenous peoples issues, but also on the guidelines for a just transition towards an environmentally sustainable economy and society for all. And this just transition guideline is critical in shaping our approach to what a new economy also with COVID, after COVID, needs to look like, and how we value work and value knowledge and skills among indigenous peoples. This would also sort of play into the issue of informality, where a lot of indigenous traditional knowledge and skills are considered to be within the realm of informal economy in the rural areas. And this is where sort of re-evaluating what contributes towards a sustainable economy, what kind of work, what kind of skills contributes towards a sustainable economy will be more and more important. I'll end on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rishabh, for this very insightful presentation. We have some hands clapping here, virtual hands, and I'll pass on the floor to our final speaker for this session. And Sandra, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you to the organizers for inviting Panho to be here. I'm trying to share a few slides. I would appreciate it if you could confirm that you can see.
Yes, we do.
Thank you very much. I wanted to give you, first of all, a quick overview of what is the Pan American Health Organization, how are we working, and why it is so relevant in this very enriching discussion, the ILO Convention 169 for the work that we do. The Pan American Health Organization is the regional office for the Americas of the World Health Organization. As you can see, our headquarters are in Washington, DC. And we have 27 country offices. We are a specialized agency of the OAS, and also we're part of the United Nations system, as Martin was mentioning. It is important to highlight that the Pan American Health Organization is the only WHO regional office with ethnicity as a cross-cutting theme. And this is why we are involved in these interagency United Nations groups at the global level also, where we work very closely with ILO colleagues, with Martin in particular, and also, of course, part of the regional system. Regarding Panho's normative frameworks, I thought it was very important also taking into account what the other speakers have been mentioning and the relevance of the convention right now. Panho started work with indigenous peoples in 1993. And from that time, all our counterparts, which are actually the ministries of health of this region, Latin America, and of course also the US and Canada, considered that there was a need to have differentiated approaches when addressing the health of indigenous peoples and other populations. And therefore, there were a series of resolutions that were approved from 1993. There were other important resolutions that of course take into account also the ILO convention, like for example, the Health and Human Rights Resolution, which was approved in 2010. But I want to focus particularly on these two very recent instruments that were approved by our member states. The first one is the Policy on Ethnicity and Health, which was approved in 2017, following a very large and actually a very complex process of consultation with indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, and members of other ethnic groups. This policy on ethnicity and health, for the first time, actually there is not a precedent within the UN system addressing particularly the health of all these groups, but also involving all these groups in what were the main priorities that they considered should be addressed by member states when considering health aspects. So this policy has 5 specific lines of action, and I'm just gonna mention them so you can have a quick overview. The first one is the generation of evidence, we know that unfortunately for many countries in the Latin American region, the data that we have on the health situation of these groups is non-representative. And of course, countries, despite the advances, have not done it in a systematic manner. So this was the first consolidated consensus, let's say, for this policy on ethnicity and health. The second one is policy action. And this is particularly relevant for the topic we have here today, because this policy builds upon the ILO convention, among other instruments. And of course, the most interesting thing in this process was that indigenous peoples were highlighting the relevance also of the ministries of health and of health personnel to be familiar with the provisions of the ILO convention. So I think this is particularly relevant and something very important for you to keep in mind. Another line of action was the strengthening of the networks, which basically implied working closely and from the very beginning with all these groups, with indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, and members of other ethnic groups. Fourth line of action, very relevant and very much connected with what was being said before, is the recognition of ancestral medicine and the integration of traditional and Occidental medicine. And the last one is capacity building at all levels, which also includes building capacity among health personnel on all these provisions that are relevant when we address the health of indigenous peoples, including, for sure, the provisions of the ILO convention. This was approved in 2017, again, after a very long process of consultation with indigenous groups at national, sub-regional, and regional levels. And again, it is a very important reference for the indigenous peoples in our region. Following up this policy, in 2019, this is very recent, last year, the strategy and plan of action on ethnicity and health was approved. And it's a strategic line number 2, which refers particularly to this promotion of political action, includes one specific indicator, which is number of countries and territories that have ratified ILO Convention number 1669. So we're very much looking forward to strengthen all our collaboration with ILO colleagues, of course, to measure what are being the improvements. And apart from this, from mentioning, of course, the ratification status, we are also very much engaged with our counterparts through our country offices to promote the capacity building on the provisions that are relevant from the convention. I also wanted to highlight how do we see, in terms of a practical approach, some of the provisions of the ILO convention in the work that PAHO is doing in the field. Of course, at first, I think it's very important to keep in mind that we have these political frameworks that I just mentioned, which were highly reiterated by the peoples, more than, of course, the ministries of health had to approve because they are our counterparts. But the most relevant thing is that this followed a very, very complex process of consultations, and indigenous peoples were bringing precisely these instruments to be part of these resolutions to be approved by ministries of health. Now, from a practical point of view, it's very important, as I was mentioning before, the capacity building that we are trying to do at country levels, not only with healthcare personnel that are directly working with indigenous communities, but also at the ministries of health levels. This is particularly important. And of course, bringing this component of community-based health services that are taking into account all those cultural conditions. In this regard, PAHO promotes intercultural approaches to health through different tools. For example, the promotion of knowledge dialogues has been an instrumental way to approach healthcare personnel with indigenous communities. Of course, it is also very important to highlight the significance of the indigenous structures. We need to make sure that we are addressing the real people, the appropriate people, and that all this is done in a very inclusive manner. And of course, participation and engagement with indigenous peoples is crucial for any intervention that affect their health, where they should be protagonists from the very beginning. This is something that is very, very important, and PAHO has a very, very long experience in this regard. Well, we wanted to touch a little bit also, and now, I gave you a little bit an overview on how is the policy framework and how is a little bit the practicality in general terms. But now in the context of the pandemic of COVID-19, PAHO has been doing very important work during the past months with our indigenous leaders through our country offices. And we have consolidated a document that just came out. I believe it is the first one from the World Health Organization offices addressing COVID-19 with indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, and other ethnic groups. Very important is this document compiles all the considerations and all the concerns that our indigenous peoples from the region were bringing to us through our country offices. And that's why it was a very participatory process. Again, it is a general document that of course will need to be adapted to the different national contexts, but it does include very, very specific recommendations at different levels. So in this regard, I'd like to highlight and the document is, I think Martin has shared the link there. It's available in Spanish and in English, and I think in Portuguese, it may have already also been translated. Coordination with indigenous networks through PAHO country offices. This is extremely important. As I was mentioning, PAHO has ethnicity as a cross-cutting theme in the organization, and this means that in all our country offices, we do have a focal point working with ethnicity, particularly with indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, and depending, of course, of the national context. So we have coordinated all the work with our indigenous networks, and of course, Afro-descendants as well, through our country offices. The recommendations or considerations that you will see in this document involve, of course, indigenous peoples themselves in combination with healthcare personnel. One of the tools that we are very much highlighting, because we have seen very important results in other health areas, is the promotion of knowledge dialogues or intercultural dialogues. Of course, the engagement between community leaders and healthcare personnel. Another very, very important component that of course touches upon many different points that are very relevant, and especially when we talk about community engagement, is information. In the context of the pandemic, we know that of course information is extremely important, but it is not only addressing how the information on COVID-19 and any measures that could prevent this pandemic is translated into indigenous languages. Apart from that, this information needs to be culturally adapted. This can only happen if there is a real engagement with indigenous communities and healthcare personnel. But at the same time, it should be available in the formats that are accessible to the community, which is also a very, very important point. Why? Because many of these communities, for example, they use oral transmission and not retail transmission. So this, I think it's very, very important to take it into account, and in the document is very much highlighted. Other important considerations or recommendations, for example, at the government level, is of course the promotion of the ethnic variable. Again, the issue of data collection in terms of health, it is extremely relevant, and it continues being a top priority for the populations of our region. Of course, that the campaigns that are promoting public health information, again, are culturally adapted, and that, you know, the governments take into account what are those realities, what are those cultural contexts. The respect to traditional medicine is very important, and one of the recommendations actually for healthcare personnel in combination with indigenous leaders is precisely to review and assess what are those practices that are being used, for example, in antiseptic measures, to understand whether they could or not be in contradiction with any of the recommendations that PAHO and WHO are promoting in the context of this pandemic. For healthcare personnel, well, of course, actions to eradicate racism and discrimination. This is extremely important, that we do not promote stigmatization within these populations when we are addressing anything that is related to this pandemic. And of course, also contemplating different realities, because we know that indigenous peoples are completely different, and the approaches are going to be totally different, whether we are talking about indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation, urban, rural, etc., etc. This is extremely important to take it into account, particularly by the governments. There is not a unique solution, and this is crucial. For healthcare personnel, again, involvement of the leaders in any decision that affect their health, so that any measure could really be feasible, because otherwise, if healthcare personnel is working only partially or not with the right representatives of indigenous communities, we cannot ensure that the measures taken are going to be sustainable. Having culturally adapted training, any information that we promote on this pandemic or in the context of this pandemic should be adapted to the realities. Involvement of traditional healers, of course. Here you have the cover of the document that has just been released. That's the cover in Spanish, but again, you have it in other languages. And this is the presentation from my side. I'm very happy to take any questions. And again, thank you very much for your time.
Sandra, for this very, very hands-on overview of the work that PAHO is doing in this particular situation, and also mirror some of the challenges that we see in other policy areas, and that the overall government coordination and coherence is also important to address complex crises like COVID is currently going on. So we have a number of questions, and I would give the floor to, I would ask Jessica simply to guide us through the questions as they were coming in, and maybe also direct the questions as far as possible to the specific panelists that we're here. So Jessica, over to you.
Yes, trying to see. Just 1 second. Okay, so first question, could you explain a little bit more about the process of elaboration of the policy on ethnicity and the involvement of indigenous people in this process?
Sure, thank you very much for this question. Well, the policy on ethnicity and health followed a very long process for various reasons. First of all, there were difficulties to get consensus on the conceptual framework of how this policy was even going to be discussed, because as you may imagine, because of the variety within countries, the differences between countries, where some terms could be used in a discriminatory way, where in other countries, if you didn't use such term, you were not involving every specific group. At the same time, the final decision of sitting together populations that are so diverse, like indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, Roma people, which were also included, of course, in this discussion, and members of other ethnic groups, made it extremely complex. So for a couple of years, we had very large processes of consultation. Through, again, the role of the focal points on ethnicity from PAHO was crucial, because through our country offices, we managed to get in touch with all these networks, and of course, having the representativity that was required. I believe it was a very, very unique process, which has even been taken as a model by other UN agencies that are now developing similar processes. But I think the most relevant thing also was that after such complexity, we realized that the priorities by the different groups were very much alike. And there was no problem between the different groups to sit down and agree on what were going to be the priority lines of action. Thanks.
Thank you. Another question. What is the impact of COVID-19 on the work of indigenous communities, given their greater reliance on traditional methods of work?
Well, in the region of the Americas, we're seeing many different things. We're seeing, of course, that this is one of the groups that is being particularly affected for different reasons, not only because historically indigenous peoples have been facing discrimination, lack of access to quality and culturally adapted health services, etc., etc. At the same time, we do know that indigenous peoples have a very strong capacity to pass pandemics, to survive, to have their systems in place, and also to structure themselves. So we have seen different communities where the efforts have been particularly important. For example, even deciding to close their communities and not to receive outsiders so that COVID cannot be spread, or to develop specific campaigns, communication campaigns, particularly addressing some of the issues. So in the considerations, in the technical document we have published, you may find some of these examples. And I think, of course, we cannot generalize because, again, communities are very different and there are many, many differences between the countries of the region. But of course, the component of traditional knowledge is definitely very, very remarkable, and in the context of this pandemic as well. Thank you.
Maybe on that question, I could give the floor to Maria Victoria as well, maybe because we have a high number of indigenous peoples working also in the informal economy outside their communities, but also in the rural area. So, and because of reliance on that, there is also a specific impact because the, Maria Victoria, would you like to take up this question as well, or any other of the panelists?
Sure. Well, there are different impacts. I think the impacts go beyond the sphere of health. There is an impact on the education of indigenous children and youth. Especially in Latin America, there are some many regions where indigenous peoples live that have no access to internet or very low access. So this has in some countries have already started to reconsider the possibility of online education for indigenous peoples because it's simply impossible to do that. Apart from that, there are increased cases of domestic violence among indigenous communities. There is also the language is a big problem. There are some communities that are not able to fully understand the COVID situation because there is no information in their own language and the information is not culturally appropriate. So this is just some of the issues that raise, and also there is of course a concern that because of the economic crisis that has been generated by COVID, there would be an increase or more promotion of resource extraction projects that might also develop into conflicts, and then the issue of consultations come again into place, how to consult and involve indigenous peoples also in the designing of these economic responses. These are just some of the elements or issues that are coming into discussion now in these times.
Thank you so much. We have another question from, there was Shamila who wanted to ask a question, and I was not sure whether that was already the question that was mentioned by Jessica. If not, Shamila, you could take the floor and ask a brief question as well.
Yes, I asked her question. She has a follow-up question.
Yeah. So I only asked those questions, and I had a follow-up question that, like you all mentioned, that consideration of the voice of indigenous people is very important, but I think it's also very important for them to be aware of like different global standards of employment, and in that case I feel that intervention of NGO is also very important. So does this convention number 169 support different NGOs initiatives on increasing awareness and education of indigenous people on global standards? Like, just a question.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Is there any other questions? Maybe we can take them together and then give the panelists a last round. If
yeah,
needed.
There seems to be one last question from Manos. This question is for Sandra. And they're asking, could you please give an example where you have seen an impact between healthcare personnel and Indigenous people?
All right. So why don't we start with you, Sandra, with that question?
Sure. I think a very remarkable field of health where we have seen a great impact, and that's why actually we're promoting these intercultural dialogues, has been the field of maternal health and reduction of maternal mortality, where we've had a very, very important impact through the promotion of these knowledge dialogues, making close healthcare personnel with Indigenous peoples, with leaders, and so on, how women that could not go, for example, to a maternal health facility started attending this. After different commitments from both sides, I think it's a fascinating area. And that's why we think that within this context of the pandemic, COVID-19, this promotion of intercultural dialogues can really make an impact. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. We are almost at the end. I think it just remains for me to thank, first of all, let me start the other way, all the participants, and then also all the panelists. I think it was a very interesting exchange, putting these things together, even for us in the office and in the UN system. The idea was to go to have an engagement also with an academic audience. We believe that these issues have important theoretical underpinnings. At the same time, many challenges exist in practice when policymakers need support and advice. So I think this exchange between research, academics, and practitioners is very important. So I think we achieved that objective. So thank you much to also, if this is recorded and will be publicly available. And obviously, we can be contacted at the ILO and at Tahoe, and we look forward to future engagements on this topic in particular. Thank you to all, and wish you a nice afternoon or day, depending where you are. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.